afternoon, everyone. Thank you for all being here. Welcome to PSE. I hope you have liked what you've heard and how we're trying to connect research and the most important pressing question for society. So what I'm going to talk about today really draws on what was presented in the rest of the day, not entirely coincidentally, since I had the chance to invite the speakers today, whom I thank for their excellent presentation. So I'm really going to build on that and to some extent repeat a little bit what they have said, but not too much, and start from there. So it's a little bit cheap to start with headlines, but I'm still going to do that. These are just from Le Monde yesterday and today. The first one is today, chaos climatique, climate chaos. That's Gutierrez warning us of possible climate chaos. Those were the last 12 months on record, and this is also, it is now very likely that the will be above 1.5 degrees in the next 5 years. That's a usual headline we are getting at this, unfortunately. Another, maybe a less usual headline is the second one. There are discussions in Bonn. This past few started on June 3rd. Is going on at the moment. And the big topic of discussion is funding for climate for the southern country. And I think that's a little bit more unusual that becomes a topic of discussion. Not that the southern country haven't made, or the low-income country haven't made this case before, but that it is being relayed as a headline in a newspaper. So obviously, I think that's a good thing for reasons that should be obvious already from the presentations we've seen today and for reasons I'm going to elaborate. But I also think just from a positive political economy point of view, it's a sign that something is happening, that there is really a beginning of a movement, and now it's time to beat the trumpet, and someone might be willing to listen. Another thing, another headline, that's from June 2nd. I thought was just an interesting illustration of kind of the collapse of the two biggest headlines of the last week, which was the Indian election and the heat wave in India. 33 polling agents died because it was too hot. So obviously a lot more people have died during this heat wave in India, where Ethan already told us temperature above 50 degrees were hit in some part of the country at some point, which is really even unimaginable if you haven't been in that temperature. I haven't been in that temperature, but the fact that connecting it to even the functioning of democracy was kind of interesting. What is also interesting to me is that for the first time, and at least since I followed this topic, in the newspaper in France, Le Monde is the newspaper I read, and in the New York Times, a lot of the headlines were about the disproportional toll that high temperature have on the poor. This is something we have known for some time. This is something that Isha discussed, and I'm going to discuss some more. So it's not news, but in general, the covering of climate change until now has really been about what it is going to do to us. And it's kind of the first time that we are seeing, even, and if there was a heat wave, there is a heat wave. But this time there really was stories about people having difficulty, needing to work and not being able to not go to work and not even being able to work. The type of things we are writing papers about are finally making their way in the political discourse in rich countries. I think that's very interesting and needs to be built upon. So let's, what I want to do today is kind of put the literature together, but mostly with the objective of presenting a proposal, very much like Gabriel did yesterday. So there is a kind of somewhat policy angle or even political angle to this talk. And I'm going to make it into a few steps. The first steps is these questions about who is responsible for climate change. So the people arrive, low and middle income countries arrive to the negotiation in Bonn, and they say rightly, look, you did this to us, which is true, because historically, the emission responsible for climate change. So we saw a great paper showing that the impact of 1 ton of carbon is mostly linear, but it's linear in the stock. It doesn't go away. So all of the stock of emission that is in the atmosphere, they've come from the development path that was chosen, or at least followed by rich countries which are industrialized rich today. So there is definitely a historical responsibility. Rich countries will agree to that, but then are prompt to say, well, that was then, but now the responsibility are much more divided. And in particular, I took this graph from yesterday's presentation by Beatrice, saying, look, China. So here the countries are kind of bigger when they emit more, and also more dark. And you can see this kind of huge China blob saying, well, they emit a lot, and so maybe we should think about China. And then that brings it back to, this gap. The history was bad, but now all the problem is really with today middle-income country, and then in the future, all these poor countries will become less poor, and they'll start emitting, and this is what we should be worried about. And that's first of all, that's it's not clear you would, at a first order, at a moral level, you would agree with this argument, but fine. It's just not very accurate, even as a way of representing the world today. Let's leave the history aside for a moment. If we are just looking at emission today, one thing that we need to remember when we say that China emits a lot of CO2, yes, that's true, but they emit CO2 to build cars that are then shipped to Europe, not to the US, at least not anytime soon, it seems to be. But many things that are being produced in China are being consumed in other places. So this map has been produced by combining production matrices with trade, and saying, well, China produces a lot of cars, but then it exports them. So China is a huge CO2 exporter. So is India. So if you're blue in this map, you export more CO2 than you import. And then the US is very, very red because they import a lot of things that they don't produce on their territory, and likewise for Europe. So we need to correct for that, because what matters, of course, is not what is produced where, but what is consumed where, because this is where the decisions are being made. So for that, we need to think about what's the right way to define a carbon footprint. And what is being typically reflected when we count carbon emission at the country level is the first one, which is point of use emission, so what is being produced. So imagine you're driving your electric car. Your point of use emission is zero, because you don't contribute to, electricity doesn't even count. There is no use of fossil fuel in driving of an electric car. Now, there is a second measure that takes into account the fact that, someone has to produce this electricity, so what's the carbon content of the electricity? If we manage to have mostly clean electricity in Europe, they're certainly working on it. We saw a paper saying there are maybe limits to that, but we are certainly working on it. That's measure 2, and that's also improving over time as we are moving towards more renewable. But then there is measure 3, which is really conceptually the measure that we should be using, which is total carbon footprint or consumption emission. I'm going to use the two a bit interchangeably. And that includes for the car everything that went to producing that car. And that is obviously the relevant metric. Unfortunately, that is much harder to calculate. At the individual level, it's hard to calculate. At the country level, it's hard to aggregate because you need to figure out the carbon content on everything and what everybody consumes, and we just don't really know how to do that. So we can't do it like at person by person level. But what people have done instead, and in particular Lucas Chancel and his collaborator using data from World Inequality Lab here at PSE, what they've been trying to do is to say, well, let's make some assumption, or between me and you, a lot of assumption, but let's make assumptions that can relate the consumption of people to their income. So we can use survey data that says, you know, depending on your income, what do you consume and what's the carbon content of this consumption. So we can have surveys that tell us the carbon footprint of each individual at what level it is, and then we can compute an elasticity with respect to income. And it's not one, so as people become richer, their consumption profile becomes proportionally more green. The reason is that cars become less important in their budget. But it's not zero either, it's very high. So that means that the richer people are, the more they consume, and the more they consume, the more CO2 they emit. Once we have those measures, we can combine that with distribution of income around the world, which they have from the wheel, and therefore calculate both within and across country as a good estimate of how much is being, of what is the distribution of total carbon footprint of people around the world. And when you do that, and then you can kind of rank people by income or by consumption emission, you get this nice, nifty 10-50 rule that first appeared in a Chancel-Piketty paper. And it works both ways. So it's the 10% highest polluter worldwide are responsible for 50%, almost 50% of global emission. And it kind of works the other way as well, which is the bottom 50% of the world are responsible for about 10% of global emission. It didn't have to work both ways. It's by luck that it works both ways. But it's nice. There is only one thing to remember. Another way, and then we can do that by country. So you get these very striking things that the top 1% consume 100 times more than about 100 times more than the bottom 50% of the population. A statistic that stuck to me here is that an American in the top 10% of the income distribution of the U.S. has a total carbon footprint that is 122 times that of a person who lives in the bottom half of the distribution of income in Africa. So this is basically putting some additional words on what Ethan pointed out, is that basically the poorest people are responsible for almost nothing of climate change, and it's even more nothing when you take into account consumption emission. So high polluters live mostly in rich countries. You can see it from this map, which is color-coded by emission. In particular, the whole of sub-Saharan Africa minus South Africa basically contribute almost nothing to climate change. Interestingly, and this is a newer work by Lucas Chancel and Tancred Voiturier, insist on that, is that within country inequality is increasingly important. So in other words, there are very wealthy people in India, and they consume a lot. And they have huge houses with many, many, many floors and many cars and so on and so forth. And on the other hand, they are, in particular in Europe, as the consumption footprint of everyone has gone down, the inequality in carbon emission has also increased. So in the beginning of their period, by 1990, most of the inequality in CO2 emission seemed to have been across country, and now there is about a third within country and 2/3 across country. So it means that we kind of need to take into account also to think about how to attribute responsibility. Okay, having said that, what does this imply? One thing it implies is that it's really important to keep in mind that there really is no trade-off between eradicating poverty and emission. And it it kind of quickly comes in saying, well, you know, this is how we develop, but we can't afford, you know, people in Africa or in Bangladesh to now become less poor, because what would happen to climate change? Because we're starting from such a low base and such low consumption level, even if we manage, for example, to brought everyone in the world to the level of $2 per capita, that's the target of eliminating extreme poverty. We are not talking high wealth, but that they're so poor to start with. That would even $2 per capita is so poor to start with that it would increase emission only by 2%. So there is no trade-off between eradicating poverty and climate change, and it is very important to be reminded of that, because that's a bit of a risk that as people, as of 5 minutes ago, have discovered that climate change is a problem and suddenly kind of have pivoted to that, potentially leaving a lot of people behind with a lot of problems today. So we can't abandon those problems. So let's keep that first problem in its first fact in mind. The responsibility are really unequally distributed, with poor people in the world being responsible for none of the issue, to exaggerate, almost not at all. The cost of climate change, however, are going to be felt primarily in the poor part of the world. Ishan spent a lot of time on that, so I'm not going to spend too much time on that, but just remind you, for people who came in between also, of the kind of headline facts here. Why is that? Well, the first problem is that poor countries tend to be in places that are already hot today. So this is today's temperature from the Global Impact Lab. And you can see that, yes, poor countries, so it tends to be hot in places which are both poor and quite populous. So a lot of poor people live in places that are very hot today. And therefore, as the planet warms by 2050 and then by 2100, they are going to get the places that will get very many hot days, and hot here is defined by above 35 degrees. If we did above 50 degrees, we would get fewer places, but that would be even more concentrated among very populated, very poor places. You find those in poor countries, the northern part of Brazil, the region in sub-Saharan Africa, in particular, Sahel and whatever is just south from West Africa to Sudan and the Horn of Africa. And then the north of South Asia, so that's Pakistan, North India, Bangladesh. In addition, which is not in this map, is that there are also places that are often very, very humid, which means that well-bulb temperature, which is really what is injurious to the human body, is even worse. So those are the places that are going to, even though the planet is not going to warm up quite equally, but suppose first approximation it is, because really what matters is very, very hot days. That's going to primarily affect poor countries. The second fact, which Ishan also spent a lot of time on, is that we are not equal. All us in the world are not in equal position to cope with this very hot temperature. How do we know that? Well, climate change is happening, but even before that, there was variation in weather. And so what you can do, and what they do in the Climate Impact Lab work, is that they compare places that are similar, say two districts in India. One of them happens to be hotter in a particular year, more hot days above 35. One of them is hotter the next year. And you can see whether you have more death relatively in the district that happen to be hot in a particular year relative to another one. So importantly, what this means is that this really is only looking at the impact of temperature in the kind of normal range. We don't know about disaster, so that doesn't cover disaster. It's just the impact of heat. Which, by the way, I was interested to see that in India, heat is not counted as a natural disaster. So, there is automatic social policy when there is floods or droughts, etc., but not for the heat. And so then, even though heat does kill people. So on the right, you have here a version of the program of the effect that is showed for other things, which is the impact of a number of hot days compared to the reference temperature of 20 degrees in places that are hot or cold and places that are low income and high income. And the key thing to see is that places that are, of course, as people get used to warmer temperature, they get experience. So, for example, the first heat wave in France killed a lot of people because we didn't know we had to check on our grandmothers. And the next one killed fewer people because you just don't do that anymore. So there is adaptation coming from learning. Some of it is very quick, like this one. Some of it could be faster, slower, because we need investment. So that's going from cold to hot. But most importantly is you also get differential gradient going from low income to high income. And in particular, even places that are hot, they know what to do when it's very hot, but they just can't do it because they are not equipped to do it. And the result, if you compare, suppose it's very hot in Texas, people can take their air conditioning car to go from their air conditioning home to their air conditioning office, and mostly they're going to be fine. At least they're not going to die. And whereas if it's very hot in Pakistan, people, first, they don't have air conditioning, and second, they need to continue doing their work. A lot of it will be outside, so even if it's not in farming, it could be in construction. And that's why it's potentially much more mortal. And when you put these two together, you get this map that I think is probably one of the maps that affected me the most, or one of the kind of findings that affected me the most in recent years, and that has really prompted my getting really jumping up and down about this issue, still from the Climate Impact Lab work as their QJE paper, which show us, based on this data, which is combining the fact that the poorer country will get more hot days and the fact that these hot days will kill more people in poor countries, look at the projected mortality damage by 2100 by geography. And what you have in the color coding tells you if it's very red, then you get more damage. If it's very blue, you get benefits. And someone asked the question, well, how come you get benefits, say, in the north of France or in Sweden, despite the fact that there are a lot of old people in France? And actually, the answer is that, when it's very hot in the summer, it's also less cold in the winter. And a lot of old people die of cold. So I think that's one reason why the demography is not, it doesn't play against the poor countries, because they benefit from these less cold winters. So you get this map, and really all of the costs, and this shows in the next graph as well, all of the costs are in poor countries, are in very poor countries, like in particular in Africa, in Pakistan, North India, Bangladesh. And this is averages, but then the little bell curves here show the kind of variability, because there is a lot of unknown we don't know, so there is a lot of noise around this estimate of what the climate change will be, so you have potential scenarios, and some of the scenarios are really scary, and they are, possible. So when you summarize that, you get an extra 73 deaths per 100,000 people. That doesn't sound very much until you think it's about 6 million people by 2100, so it's a fair amount of people. And what is really striking is two things. Number one is what Ishan already said, which is it's as high as all the infectious diseases combined. So it's like if we manage to get rid of malaria and pneumonia and all that, we would kind of undo that just with the effect of heat. Number two, it's really sensitive to whether we manage to go from the high emission scenario, which is the one that is mapped out here, to a lower emission scenario, but still not super low, kind of moderate. It really highlights the effort, and that's related to the presentation we saw about 1 ton of carbon. Highlight the effort that really every single one of us has to do, because we don't have to get to perfection. The effects are so non-linear. The effect of high temperature is really so much at the top that even avoiding a little bit of that is kind of a huge gain. So that, I think, is kind of one message to take home, regardless what you can do on the broader kind of political economy world. Is, 1 ton of carbon, he told that to us today, that has an impact, linear impact on the warming, and that has a much more than linear impact on the damages because of that non-linearity. So that's one thing I want you to remember. The next thing then we can say, well, this is really striking that all of the emissions, or most of the emissions, are due to the behavior, the choices made by rich people. And then the mortality costs are borne by the poor people. So that seems really unacceptable, just at a basic moral level. And so I kind of want to calculate how unacceptable. If we wanted to put a price on this, could we? And we can, as long as we're willing to make some assumptions about the value of a statistical life. So that's a big as long, because that seems a bit odd to put a value on human life. But, we do it all the time. We do it when we decide to build a new bridge, because the number of lives saved is put against the cost. We do it when we did it when we decided to close cities, close lockdown for COVID. Combining the economic cost with the life saved. And there are numbers that are used for that. So, for example, the EPA uses a value of about $10 million per human life. So using that same paper, the Carlton et al. Paper, that Ishan is one of many, many friends co-authored on, estimate an impact of 1 ton of carbon. So once we trace, as we saw from the paper today, the impact of 1 ton of carbon on temperature, and then from there, from temperature to mortality, and put a dollar value on the death. You could play with that. If you don't like the 10 million adjusted for GDP, you use another one. And you get this number of $37 per ton. And now we can combine it, not with the production emission, which I've argued is not the right footprint to use, but with the consumption emission, which is the right footprint to use. It makes a big difference for Europe. And you get that number of 14 billion tons per year times $37 of damage, so about $500 billion is what we inflict, the value of the damage we inflict on poor countries every year, we being US plus Europe combined, in terms of mortality damage. So that doesn't take into account all the other damages that we could compute, but I think this is kind of a stark way to put it, in saying that's just the kind of the price tag of the way we decide to live. So once we have said that, this kind of makes for a thorny political issue, because first order, in the next many years, the biggest problem, not all the problems, it's good for Swedish children to think that there will be problem in Sweden because they need to continue advocate for it. But first order in the next many years, the biggest problems are going to be in the low-income countries. But the principal margin of actions remain in the north because this is where most of the consumption takes place. So have we displayed until now a great capacity to deal with this kind of problems? And I would say no. The COVID experience suggests that we are not very good at sharing, solutions to problems. We are more good at sharing problems, but not very good at sharing solutions to problems. The first graph on the left shows the whatever it takes. These are color from the IMF, additional spending and foregone revenue in response to COVID-19 pandemic. So it's basically fiscal expenditure to support citizens during the COVID pandemic. And you can see that the rich countries, France included, spent a lot of money to support their citizens, which was great. And they should have done that. On average, about 27% of rich countries' GDP were spent in fiscal stimulus measures during COVID. for France, the president can go whatever it takes and borrow, and this is great. But if you are in Togo and you try to say whatever it takes, the financial market is saying not really. And as a result, the low-income countries spend 2% of their much smaller GDP on fiscal stimulus measures during COVID. At the very beginning of COVID, Abhijit and I wrote an op-ed saying we need a Marshall Plan for poor countries because clearly it's going to be possible to restart very quickly when the COVID goes away, because this is what happens, after war. Even places that are completely devastated, if there is investment, really catch up quickly. So we should, but after World War II, there was a Marshall Plan that kind of helped Europe do that. We'll need to prepare to have that for poor countries. It was not very influential. If the US had wanted to help all of Sub-Saharan Africa to reach 27% of the Sub-Saharan African GDP in terms of fiscal expenditure, they would have needed to spend the equivalent of 10% of what they spent on themselves. So 10% is not nothing, but it's not huge. So it was completely possible to share the solution financially. The increase in aid flow towards poor countries were negligible, a very, very hard to spot. And then, of course, there was the vaccine story that we all know about, that exactly at the same direction. So that's kind of, during this moment, in fact, we wrote another op-ed to tell you how influential I am. We wrote another op-ed with Abhijit just before a G7 meeting, saying it's really important that we spend we help in sending vaccines to poor countries, because the argument was that's going to demonstrate that we are willing to help, we are one world, we can work together. And our argument was that's going to be really important for getting cooperation on climate change. And so this G8 came and went, nothing was done for vaccine, and of course climate change negotiations have been becoming ever difficult after. So have we changed? Well, maybe not. So John Kerry, who is was the climate ambassador for the US, announced the policy very clearly. The US under no circumstance will pay climate reparations. Of course, that's climate reparations. So what he's thinking about the past. So this is not necessarily meaning that they are not ready to do an effort moving forward. But that's why I didn't talk about history at all. I think it is much wiser to focus on the future. At the COP28, there was maybe a semi-breakthrough or something like that called the Loss and Damage Fund, which finally countries agreed to vote on having a fund devoted to help poor countries adapt to climate change. This advocacy group has another reason why they would like to reach $400 billion a year, and they compare it to what is in the Loss and Damage Fund, and that's $700 million a year. So it's not even in the same ballpark. And in addition, most of these $700 million a year is relabeling of funding that they were going to spend on developing countries anyways. So why are we in this position for the COP28 fund? On the one hand, the rich countries absolutely vetoed obligations because they don't want to commit to a liability that is the size of which we don't know. That's one. And on the other hand, voluntary transfer, which is what was decided, require the approval of budgets by assembly, citizen, etc. in each country, and this is just not very popular. One could not really imagine now, for example, the French administration coming and trying to convince French citizens to spend a lot of money for a loss and damage fund. So in general, the track record on sending money to poor countries for climate change is not excellent. In 2013, there was a commitment for $100 billion in climate finance to poor countries. It took a while to reach it, but it was finally reached in 2022. This is from a report by the OECD. But when you look at the way that it was met. It is mostly loans. More than half of the funds are in the form of loans. That's the red bars over there. This is what comes from public institutions, and it's mostly loans. And it's mostly loans for mitigation projects. So that really has nothing to do. That might be a perfectly fine idea to do a mitigation project in countries where there is a lot of scope for it, no problem. But it has nothing to do with compensating for climate change, because we are basically giving people a loan to do their work for us, because a ton abated in Ghana has the same impact on the world and therefore on me as a ton abated in France. So sending a loan to Ghana to do mitigation effort is not redistribution. It's even worse than that. So there is a recent analysis by Reuters of the OECD report, plus their own little research, which point out that not only those are loans, but a lot of those loans, so you see France here at the top, mostly giving loans. It's not just loans, but most of the loans are loans at market interest rate. So 18 billion of the 100 billion are loans at market interest rate, and an additional 11 billion require purchase in lending countries. So we are giving people loan at market interest rate to purchase our machine to do mitigation. It's just not, it's not, we can't count any of that as really doing our share, right? So, in other words, today, we have not, until today, we really have not, are nowhere near doing what is, what corresponds to repaying that moral debt that we are continuing to accumulate. So how to move forward? So there are really several kind of policy blocks that I've been thinking about how we kind of unblock, at least conceptually. The first one is this tension between mandatory and voluntary. And the second is how to use the fund. So we really need to commit now to a mechanism to raise money for a fund, like a loss and damage fund, which would be exclusively designed for low-income countries, for low-income people, really, low and middle-income people, to adjust, which would be fair, nationally and internationally, in terms of both how it raises money and how it is distributed, which would be permanent, not just like every year we decide how much we can spend, and ideally would provide some incentive to mitigate along the way. So we consider two scenarios. One is, suppose we try to raise $500 billion, and one we just try to raise the $100 billion corresponding to previous commitment. So a number of options have been discussed, in particular last year at the Paris Forum. I'm going to skip them to go to my two proposals, which are both based on the existing negotiation that have already been in place, and therefore I don't think of this as pipe dream. I think that they can happen, potentially. The first one is the really historical landmark of a minimum tax on of the largest multinational corporation. It's really the largest multinational corporation, so 750 million in turnover. So it's not. It's a few hundred firms, not more. What was finally agreed to is a minimum tax of 15%. But what was proposed originally was 21%. So my first proposal was, can we try and increase this Pillar 2 from 15 to 21? And that money hasn't been raised already, so it's not been committed to something. We could say, let's put it into that fund. The second idea I had when I first read the EU tax observatory proposal of 2% wealth tax on the 3,000 people worldwide, and of course, Gabriel presented it yesterday. And he's talking about how to raise the money. I have an idea to spend it. That money, conveniently, would raise another $250 billion. So between the two, we could reach the amount. So the first one is Pillar 2 of the international taxation credit. What was proposed originally was 21% minimum tax rate on those corporations. What was finally decided on is 15%, which reached about 250 billion euro if there are not too much loophole. If you add the 6%, you reach an extra 290 billion a year. Even if the EU were to do this alone, without the US, that would still add 200 billion. So that's a part of it. The other part of it is the tax on billionaire, the tax on the 3,000 richest people in the world, which is just a 2% tax on their wealth, corresponding to a 30% tax on the income derived from this wealth. So we think of it in this way, very moderate, just making sure that they are paying the same amount of taxes than middle-class people on the income from their wealth. That would raise an extra $214 billion dollars in a year. So, in other words, that seems feasible, but the money is there from this, not in a way that would be very costly to any rank and file citizen of Europe or the US. Is it crazy? Well, I certainly thought it was a little crazy, or at least not likely to happen for a long time. But this is why we have a representative of the Brazil embassy here, so I want to take the opportunity to highlight the leadership of Brazil, which basically first took ownership and adopted for themselves the idea of the tax on billionaire in February, and then in April invited me to present at the finance ministry track of the G20 the proposal of linking that and the corporate tax, potential corporate tax increase. And after that, Mr. Haddad, who is the finance minister of Brazil, really kind of took it to heart. So that's, it seems there is at least something that is potentially of interest pushed by Brazil. I also think, as Gabriel pointed out yesterday, that the very fact that countries from middle-income countries is kind of taking the leadership in pushing a proposal for international cooperation is really, in and of itself, really important and interesting. Of course, it's going to be a long way. A week ago, Janet Yellen took the trouble to come out to say that no, she didn't like it after all. And when asked to clarify, she said, well, maybe the tax on billionaire is okay, but not if it's to redistribute it to other countries. So Gabriel is still alive, and my position is a bit more fragile. But, well, do we really need the US? Well, not really, no. It's not the case that all countries need to cooperate at the same time. So, for example, the international tax on corporation is already in place for 37 countries, and it kind of works, and you can even basically ramp it up to kind of do a bit of cross-border adjustment, like we know and love. We are doing that to compensate for carbon taxes. The reason why I think that it's not really a tenable position to say, well, we want to raise the money, but it should stay in the countries that raise it, is that the income that is made by this largest multinational corporation or by a billionaire is made on the basis of the whole world. The consumers are in the whole world, the producers are in the whole world. The billionaires themselves are super mobile. And they are not all in rich countries, actually. Some of them are in India, some of them are in Brazil. The world is their garden. It's kind of, and the problem of climate change is related to the consumption patterns we all have related to this multinational and the source of this wealth. So I don't really see that that if we could raise that money, it belongs to the countries where the billionaire happens to be born, which is the US principle. If you're born in the US, you're liable to tax in the US for the rest of your life, or where you happen to live at a moment. And in fact, when you ask people what they think about it, so Adrien Fabre and a team of people with him are working on basically asking these very big, very large opinion polls around the world. And one of the things they have, this is small, but I highlight the right bulk, is asking people, what do you think of a tax on a global tax on millionaires, it's the last line, funding low-income countries. So that's pretty much close to my proposal. This is from before, so it's millionaire, not billionaire, and the corporations are not there. 69% of US people are in favor of this proposal, and in general, Americans really don't like taxes. So the fact that they are in favor of these taxes actually is not cheap talk. And 84% of Europeans are in favor of this tax. So it is actually quite popular. And the very fact, I think, that you are putting an object to you're saying, well, if there was this tax on billionaire, if we increase the minimum tax of corporation, it would actually be used for that. It actually could contribute to the general popularity with citizens of the scheme, not necessarily with finance ministers who have budgets to balance. The last thing I want to talk about is, suppose you could raise that money, how would you spend it? So the moral frame I'm putting around it is that it's compensation for future life lost, but of course, once people are dead, they don't really need the money. So ideally, we should spend the money in the way that is going to compensate, to prevent them from dying in the first place. This is important to discuss that because other than the first point of really tense negotiation is where is the money coming? Like, are people going to be, for loss and damage fund, are rich countries going to be compelled to pay? And rich countries don't want to hear of that. And the second is, how would it be managed? And rich countries wanted it to be managed by the World Bank, where poor countries just want to either have UN management, which is at least one country, one vote, or even sent directly to them. The poor countries lost on both counts, so they lost on this. The fund, such as it is in the World Bank. But we need to go back and say, well, how do you think about it? So the right way to think about it is, well, what would you do with it? Why is it important? And let's not stop at who is governing it, but to do what? Well, it should go to the poor people. So let's forget country. Let's think about the poor people, because they are the ones who are the most exposed to climate change, who are the most unable to cope with it. And so a good chunk of the money could be used to fund social protection, in particular social protection in response to shocks that are related to climate. So today, basically, everyone can be connected to a bank account or to a wallet on their cell phone, such that it is easy. It's not done for everyone, but it's doable for the whole world with some investment, and it's done for a good part of the world already, such that you can easily send money to them with very, very little overhead. And there is a ton of research, and you should come back tomorrow to hear that research, that show people use that money well. So now we know that. We said, look, let's have rules, when it gets hot, when there is a drought, when there is a flood, some identified event, send, no question asked, just send money to everyone in a region. Some not so poor people will get it, but it's okay compared to the general level of poverty. That would be one. So automatic transfer to individual. There are things individual cannot do at their own level, so automatic transfers to communities. Could be villages, group of villages, or cities. And for the poorer countries, the people who are IDA eligible, who really have no way to kind of borrow when they face a big shock, again, automatic transfer to budget, simply because they end up being the insurer of last resort for their community. So that, I think, could only go to the poorest people. Why we need to do that, and I'll close on that. Well, the first one is, it's our moral responsibility. I think that would, for me, that trumps everything else. But maybe if that's not sufficient, the second one is that without true partnership, the poor countries will just stop cooperating with the rest of the world, not just on climate change, but on everything else. We saw it on Ukraine. The enthusiasm at which African country came to save the free world was not that big. And so I think that's something we need to, as low and middle income countries come into their own in terms of having a voice, it's become good realpolitik to respect that voice, no matter what you think. And the last point is, that's related a little bit to what Ishan was talking about, is that without adaptation, without funds to help countries and people adapt, mitigation will just become impossible. The reason is that in the absence of funds for adaptation, first of all, what you need as a country is, if you can, is become richer as fast as you can. And you will take shortcuts. And this shortcut could be extraordinarily costly in terms of creating climate change. Because you're not going to go you're not going to respect the forest, you're not going to, and then once the forest is cut, it's cut. Our energy needs are enormous to face hotter temperature, and the middle-income countries who can afford it are going to just guzzling up a fossil fuel in order to meet these energy needs. So that's been, for example, the official position of India, a key player, is that, well, you're very nice, but we need to find ways to find all this energy need, fund all this energy need, so we will do it. And so you can see some headline on that. If countries cannot adapt, they will instead, India at the COP26 was basically criticized over coal. So here is it, conclusion, there might still be a margin for action. Now is the time to take it before we get entrenched into more hardened political position across the world, and also before a lot of people die. Thank you so much.